what is most important is what we get to do together, how we get to practice and participate together. And so we, maybe overdid that a little bit, but we just said, so we're going to lift that portion up. And so we did a number of different practices. Some were very kind of historic, Lectio Divina. We did centering prayer. Some were a little harder to do in the room. We did a whole month on Sabbath, practicing the Sabbath. We said Sabbath is the only one of the 10 commandments that most of us brag about breaking. And so we said we want to be a community that doesn't just think, well, Sabbath is probably a good thing to do, but we do it. We practice it. And so we did a number of practices like that. Sometime when we'd be in more theological conversations, we'd be talking about some sort of concept. And then the time of practice would be a guided reflection and almost meditation on what God was saying during this teaching. But it wasn't about believing what that one person taught. It was about being launched into practicing, opening ourselves up to what God is teaching in a way that we can hear it. And so that middle section of the gathering was a teaching that leads to practice. And then the final part of the gathering was the Eucharist, gathering around the table and then being sent out into our neighborhood and into the world. And this whole Eucharistic practice changed when my friend Ian Morgan Cron came, and he's an Episcopal priest. And we just said, from your tradition, would you teach us? We have our tradition, our understanding of the table. Would you teach us? And he shared a number of things that were really moving. But one of the things he said right at the end is he said, remember, friends, we never take communion. And I remember sitting there thinking, I think that's exactly what we do. He says, you never take communion. It can only be received. He said, taking is what they did in the Garden of Eden. Grasping, clutching, but receiving is what's going to put the world back together. I just remember we just sat there for 30 seconds in silence and my brain was just... So we said the next Sunday, when you come forward, share your name so we can serve you individually, and just hold your hands open to receive, not just from the server, to receive from Christ. Communion is not just remembering something that happened 2,000 years ago. Communion is getting swept up in what Christ is doing right now, in us, through us, in the world. And so then after communion, we'd sing together. We usually end by standing and singing the doxology. And then one of the pastors would come up and say, now remember, friends, Sunday is not the main event. Our actual lives are the main event, Monday through Saturday. So as you get ready to practice this week, here are a couple thoughts for how you can practice what we did. And this ended up being, it was like 3 minutes, ended up being 3 of the most important, helpful minutes of the whole gathering, because it reminded us over and over and over, it's not merely about what we do here together. We are being propelled by Christ and through these practices to participate with Christ all week long. And then we'd stand, we'd sing, we'd receive a benediction and be sent out into our neighborhoods and into the world. So I'm kind of flying here at the end. I think my time is done and we're going to jump in and do some Q&A. But Dan, is that all?
Yeah,
is that clear?
That goodness is all out there. I love it. It's really moving to hear that, Aaron.
Thanks.
Sorry about the technical difficulties.
Oh, no worries.
We heard everything. We just didn't visually get to see your mug the whole time. But
yeah, that was probably an upgrade.
Aaron, I was able to pastor in an interdenominational church years ago that was kind of a Catholic Episcopal Baptist mashup experience, and it sounds like you're unapologetically pulling from church history and innovating it into this environment. And so in that work of pulling from what God has been doing in the church expansive over the last 2,000 years,
Yeah.
now in the present, where have you seen that this resonates with people or potentially even rubs some people the wrong way? I mean, I'm curious about the
Yeah.
possible, what is refreshing, but also in some sense can irritate a little.
Yeah,
Because I'm a
absolutely.
pastor and I know on the ground that what's in my head, what I find beautiful in liturgy doesn't, meets the real world. And so I'm curious about that experience from your perspective.
Yeah, great question. Well, since we're all friends now,
Mhm.
can I tell you about the biggest mistake I made trying to bring other traditions into worship?
Sure.
Okay, just I'll do like 45 seconds.
Yeah.
When I was leading worship at Willow, um, I really wanted to bring all these different traditions in. And so I just did it. So like one Sunday at the weekend service at Willow, we sang Kyrie eleison in a minor key. Not very smart. That was not a helpful thing. And what happened is I would get lines of people afterwards, and it was kind of in thirds. The first group, they didn't know anything about the history. So they said, "Well, that was cool. That was did you write that?" It was really new, and that was fine. The second group came up, and there was steam coming out of their ears. And they said, "We left the God saved me from the Catholic Church. Don't you dare bring it back."
Mm.
And so I wish I could have, pastorally, I wish we could have spent some time talking about that. But then the third group would come up and they often had tears in their eyes. And they would say, "Thank you for reminding me that my tradition, my past tradition wasn't all bad."
Mm.
And those were really meaningful. But what
Mm.
I learned is my big mistake was I was trying to change the form and the style at the same time. I was trying to move from just a singing time to a more formative time, but I was also trying to move from only Chris Tomlin songs to a really diverse set of music and practices. And it
Mm.
was just too much. So if I
Mm.
could go back and do it again, I would absolutely try to help us move from a sing time to a practice and formation time. But I would use all Willow's language, because my highest goal is not music education, right? My highest goal is being formed into Christ likeness. And so if I could, so maybe that would be an encouragement to
Mm.
everyone listening. If God is calling you to make some change, do it. But at least begin by using the language, the indigenous language
Yeah.
of your community,
Mm.
and people will go with you.
Oh, that's good, Aaron. I appreciate that authenticity. In my own past, I've hit moments where I'm deeply convicted and passionate about something, and then I slap it over the top of my church,
Yes, yes.
and I often I lose credibility, and then even lose people's ability to follow incrementally
Right.
in a new future. So I really appreciate that
Well, and
pastoral blender that you shared there.
yeah, and you'd had already read 10 books about it,
Yeah.
been wrestling with it for 5 years, right?
Yep. Yep. Oh
And then
yeah.
in one Sunday, we
Yep.
expect the whole community to make that whole jump it
Right.
took us 5 years to do.
Right.
So, yeah.
That's good. Aaron, another question I have is what kind of hearing this and even looking at your pictures, I'm a little intimidated
Yeah.
because I think what kind of resources does someone need to move in this direction? Like, what kind of organization does it take to actually move in this direction?
Yeah. I think one of the things that we loved was how low tech and low production it was.
Okay.
Now, I say that we were in the Willow Creek building,
Sure.
so that, everything's relative because we had a sound system. But honestly, we would have a sound system for the person who was speaking. We had one mic standing there. I mean, we had very few
Mm,
mics and very low tech. And that
mm,
was actually a value, especially in our context. Probably the biggest complexity is because we didn't want screens everywhere. We wanted to go analog. We had to print out the liturgies each week.
Okay.
And this was, I mean, I could talk for 15 minutes about all the beautiful things about analog and not adding more screens to our lives. But there's also the waste of the paper, and there's, the cost of that. So that was a little intimidating. But frankly, I mean, we've done this around our dining room table. We've done this in, our little staff team. Every Tuesday morning we met, and we begin by practicing together. And there was nothing lost by not having a sound system and having some of those things. So
that's really related to one of my curiosities. Many of the planters that I coach, I'm in relationship with are small, and they practice mid-sized communities of 10 to 30 to 40 people.
Yeah.
Some meet in houses, some meet in the back of a bar, coffee shop. And I'm wondering, how can this be done in those environments?
Yeah.
Have you seen that?
Absolutely. One of my favorite experiences we had is, maybe this is 2 years ago. We wrote a very simple Thanksgiving family table liturgy. And we wanted it went about 20 minutes, and it included all the kids. And the intention was, right before you sit down to eat, here's this little liturgy. And we did Friendsgiving that year. So we had maybe 15 people kind of crammed with kids around our little table. And we did this together, and it was so moving because you're looking people in the eye. Like, this is not watching the professionals do it. We're the professionals, we the people, we power to the people,
Yeah.
So yeah, I think one of the most compelling things is it doesn't require some of that technology that can be.
That's so good.
Yeah.
Aaron, what I'm not sure this was your intention, but it sounds like you're in some way giving the church back to the priesthood of believers.
Oh my gosh.
When potentially it's been, bound up and held tight by just a couple priests, using that language. And one of the things in our movement is that decentralization of releasing apostles, prophets, shepherds, teachers, evangelists to again awaken and then lead the body of Christ together, and then how that moves out into the larger body. And so this sounds like a theological shift almost as much as it is an ecclesiological shift.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you speak a little to the theology that kind of informs this, or what's spiritually kind of behind this? Because practically I'm really moved by this, but I'm wondering what's the theology or what's spiritually compelling you to work this out?
Yeah, I think, to start really pragmatically, what we were talking about with technology a minute ago, I realized when I was at Willow, and again, I love so many of the people at Willow. This is not an anti that or this,
Certainly.
But when I was there, we did this weekend thing where we had like this string quartet, and we had this video that was synced to it, and we had all this stuff, and it was really beautiful. It was really cool. But I remember driving home that day thinking, are we accidentally teaching people you can't do it without us? So if you want to connect with God again, come back next Sunday. Like, is that an accidental thing that we're teaching along with other things?
Wow.
And what a crime. Church is 90 minutes of an entire week, And so I think the theological shift is the Spirit of God, the kingdom, as Jesus said, is within you.
Yes.
You, not just famous Christian here, and not just through famous Christian here. You. We are already fully immersed in the presence of God.
Yes.
And so I just became totally compelled by this idea. Instead of trying to help people convince God to show up or figure out where to go, where God is, let's tap into the teaching of Scripture. You know, the Psalms. Where can I go from your Spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? Paul
Mm,
on Mars Hill, like, for it is in God we live, move, and have our being.
yes.
And so, what if instead of trying to convince God to come here or go where God is, we just say, God, thank you. I'm already immersed in your presence. How
Mm,
can I open up more? We were talking recently, it's like there's this waterfall of God's presence and blessing that we are always in. We don't earn it. And you know what? We can't stop it.
right.
But we can either choose to live like this
Yes.
or like this. And so it's almost like these spiritual practices are just humble ways of saying, of receiving what's already being poured
Yes.
all over.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Aaron, thanks. Oh, that's so good. Let's do this.
Yeah.
Lori has some questions she's going to be taking from folks.
Yeah.
I really appreciate what you're doing, Aaron. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, man.
Yes, thanks so much, Aaron. You definitely invited us into some new ways to approach worship, corporate worship. Can you maybe, again, just kind of give us a definition of formative worship and how that is distinctively different than other types of worship?
Yeah. I think expressive worship versus formative worship. And just to be clear, it's not the bad one and the good one. It's the good one and the good one, but we need both. So expressive worship is helping us express what's already going on inside. And again, we see this all over the Psalms when it's almost like our hearts overflow. And so one of the things that I used to do as a worship leader in terms of expressive worship is we'd finish a song or a reading, and I'd just say, hey, I'm going to play the piano for a minute. And I want to give you space to say to God whatever you want and need to say to God. And so we just create that space. So expression, it's so good. But if that's all there is, then it tends to be wonderful catharsis and even good expression. That's a beautiful thing. But it doesn't necessarily form us. We would never naturally express a number of things. So I realized, like, we never pray for our enemies. You know why? I never want to pray for my enemies, ever. And I'm not going to express that.
Yeah.
But the inconvenient truth is that Jesus teaches us to, and we desperately need it. And so a formative practice that we can do, this is one we actually did in 2016 when the election process was just getting so ugly. We said, every Sunday, we're going to confess our sins, sit in silence, receive an assurance, and then we're going to pray for one enemy. And not because we wanted to, in fact, we hated it. One Sunday, as the election got close, we put up the faces of both Trump and Hillary on the screen, and like the room went quiet. And we just said, don't pray for you're going to vote for, pray for the other one. And so we just had to sit there and look him in the eye and pray for his kids and pray for his marriage and pray for, I mean, just, it was terrible. We hated it. But isn't that the invitation, right? So anyways, so is that closer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
definitely. And that really ties into another question that's been asked. That's one way that times of confession, well, that kind of prayer can manifest itself. But what about how are different ways that the time of confession and assurance looks in a large group setting? Like, what are some, examples?
Yeah, well, we almost always used the confession from the Book of Common Prayer. So we confess that we have sinned in what we have done and what we have left undone. And what I loved about that is it was, again, as a bunch of evangelical and former evangelicals, it was reconnecting us to the deep streams of our people, so that was so meaningful that, millions of other Christians are confessing this today. It also gives great language. I would never naturally think to confess what I left undone, but that helped me. So that was probably the main one we did. Occasionally we would write one. if we were in a certain, in Lent or in a certain time of the year. But the assurance was a lot more open. Like I mentioned, we'd often do the psalm, as far as east is from the west. But if something else from the lectionary just reminded us that our sin is real, but it doesn't have the final word, right? It's not the whole story, thank God. So that we kept really open. And that was kind of fresh. That would remind us in a fresh way each week. So, yeah.
That's really, 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 really neat. We've got a question. We've got a number of people who are dialing in from overseas, and one question that came really in advance of this time was, how do we navigate the path between what is deeply rooted in a specific culture, like of a country, a specific country, but then also that that might be rooted within the Christian faith in a specific country's culture. And like what transcends that specificity? Like, how do we kind of?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's a deep question.
I was just gonna say, and we could spend the next couple hours talking about it. Well, I don't mean this as a cop-out, but there is certainly not a silver bullet answer to that. I think there's probably some combination of the humility of listening. And then the humility of experimenting, trying things. I mean, in my former life, there was so much pressure on the service has got to be perfect and we got to, and now we said, we're going to pray like crazy. We're going to do this together. But if something is a disaster, we will smile and we will move on. It's not a Broadway show. We're just learning to do this together. So I think there's something about the experimentation. And then also to make sure the streams of influence are really varied. I know I have found in a number of different seasons of my ministry life, I'm like, holy smokes, everyone around me believes all the same things. And those are even more dangerous when we look different. So we have kind of diverse looks, but we believe all the same stuff. And we've had all the same experience. And so to find people, like, make sure you have one really ornery person that you trust, who will tell you, make sure you have someone who's going to encourage you no matter what, because you need that too. But just to have these streams where we're really discerning together, because again, like I shared when I was at Willow, like something that was really meaningful for me, I brought that into a different context and it was terrible and unhelpful. And so maybe the final thing I would say is helping the community understand why we're doing the things we're doing. The worst things I did was when I was just like, all right, we're going to do this new thing because I think it's cool. Let's go. But when I would say, all right, let me tell you why we're going to try to confess in this way today. And once you get the heart of it, you may still not connect and you're like, well, I don't want to do that again, but I get what we're doing. And so Simon Sinek wrote that great book, Start with Why.
That's right.
Just what or how. So
yeah,
that was a really surface answer to a really, really deep question, but maybe that's a beginning starting point.
Yeah, no, that's great. And just to kind of key on something that you shared with being able to provide the why, were you the one who led or officiated the gathering every time, or did that leadership also kind of float from person to person?
Yeah, we had a team. I was the point leader. So it started with me creating the liturgy, but like right away, I'm like, if this turns into the Aaron show, first of all, I'll die. Like I can't carry this. And number two, no one wants that, And so we said right at the beginning. So I was often the host, but I almost never was the host and the preacher. So we had a lot of different voices, men and women teaching, and that was really exciting. And then the liturgists were new every Sunday. So I would work with different members of the community, and I'd say, all right, when we get to the gospel reading, this is you. Let me share, So in any Sunday, I bet we had 15 different people participating in the actual liturgy and gathering, which that was really moving. So,
yes. Yeah. And so did you all use screens or
no screens.
songs and readings, or just everything printed?
Nope. That one time we did the Hillary and Trump thing, we had to like put down the screen, like real, for that. But we did it printed. And that became, that started pragmatically. We didn't want to hang screens all over, just the wrong kind of vibe, but it became a deep value. I mean, there's something about turning your phone off, putting it in your bag, and opening up a piece of paper, tactile, tangible.
People still use that?
People still use it. It's amazing. And again, there's cost, there's waste. There's a couple things that it's not perfect. But from a formative, slowing us down, getting us out of stimulation mode, I would do it every time that way.
Yeah. Can you share with us about the sacrament and practice of baptism? Have you found a way to not just do it occasionally, but to maybe remember the sacrament?
Yeah, no, I cannot share because we never did baptism.
Okay.
Because we were, the practice was a community of Willow Creek. Baptism would happen with the whole church. So that is actually a sacrament we didn't explore.
I see.
Yeah.
And are there ways that you were able to, or would recommend that people can connect with Christian traditions that are outside of Western context?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And in fact, can I read a quote?
Yes.
Is that okay? This is what I was hoping to get to share this quote. Probably the book that has shaped me in the last year, theologian and author Barbara A. Holmes. Have you read any of her work? She wrote a book, Joy Unspeakable, that is about contemplative practices of the Black church. And it was one of these, I mean, I'm a white dude from the burbs, and I just didn't know so much of this. And she made this comment that still shakes with me. She said, if the model for contemplation is Eurocentric, then the religious experience of indigenous people and their progeny will never fit the mold. But if contemplation is an accessible and vibrant response to life and to a God who unleashes life toward its most diverse potentials, then practices that turn the human spirit inward may or may not be solitary or silent. Instead, contemplation becomes an attentiveness of spirit that shifts the seeker from an ordinary reality to the kingdom of God. And what her whole book is doing is it's dismantling, frankly, the idea that quiet means contemplative. That the way Eurocentric folks like myself do it is the way to do contemplation. Absolutely not. And so the more we get outside of our little tribes, the more we realize that's just the way I do it. And in fact, that's not even the best way. Look at this. And we start to learn. So yeah. Barbara A. Holmes, Joy Unspeakable. Buy it today. And check it out.
Thanks for sharing that resource, Aaron. This has really been a great conversation. Thank you all for attending.